Hello, I'm back in the saddle, which means I'm back with another edition of Sermon Scraps. As we're digging into it today, it'll be 1 Corinthians 11, 17 through 34 again. We again are doing a series looking at why we gather, what things we should be doing when we gather together as God's people. And I base the sermon series around Acts 2:42, which says they devoted themselves to four things: the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, the breaking of bread, and the prayers. So this week we looked at the breaking of bread from 1 Corinthians 11, verses 17 through 34. And before I walk back through this text again, one quick note for you. I have started posting my sermon manuscript online every single week. And so what my sermon manuscript is just the notes that I use to preach from. So if you ever have trouble following along or didn't catch a word or something like that, you can go back to my blog, PastorMikesMusings.com, and I'll just attach a link to it in the email that I send this out as well. And then you can read everything that I am reading along from, and then even see when I get off my manuscript and potentially remind me during the service to get back on track. So 1 Corinthians 11. Few things I didn't talk about. First, I just wanted to double down and re-emphasize the fact of when you come together. So again, he talks about this 5 times in this passage. Verse 17, I do not commend you because when you come together. Verse 18, in the first place, when you come together as a church. Verse 20, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper. And then again, he repeats this idea at the end. 33, my brothers, when you come together to eat. 34, if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so that when you come together. See, it's vital for us to be continually gathering together. There's an emphasis on us doing this as a body, weekly gathering together so that we can continue encouraging and exhorting and equipping each other to become more like Christ. And this together that he's referring to, verse 18 explicitly says, when you come together as a church. Now that word church gets misinterpreted and misunderstood a lot of times. Many of us just think it's referring to a building. The Greek word that is so often used that is translated as church today is ekklesia, which is just a gathering, an assembly, us meeting together as God's people. It can take place anywhere. According to John 4, we can meet anywhere now that we are a part of the new covenant. We also see in this beginning section here that because this is supposed to be done together, we need to fight hard to break down anything that separates us inside the church. So in this specific instance, as I mentioned, it's the haves versus the have-nots. Those who are blessed, those who are wealthy, have been celebrating communion and these love feasts together without waiting for those who weren't able to come early and bring the good food. So when we come together as the church, anyone who is a sinner is welcome here. And that also means that, as Philippians 2 reminds us, when we gather together, we need to look towards others' interests above our own. We're actually going to see that in just a couple of weeks. We're going to be digging into Ephesians 5 together because I added one extra week into this series of why do we sing, because there's 4 things that we're talking about, as I mentioned earlier, but I think another thing, one that takes up a significant portion of our weekly worship is singing. And so why are we doing that? And Ephesians 5 at the end of the section actually reminds us to submit to one another's preferences above our own. A couple other things that I didn't really get to talk about. Verse 21 says, for in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry, another gets drunk. Now, this again, the first thing that is coming out here is this idea that we need to be doing this together. We cannot do this individually, just me and God. I'm celebrating communion here by myself. It's meant to be done in community with us together. And another piece, in the Western world, we often focus on the drunk piece and say, how dare there be any drinking? And that is a sin. There's other passages that deal with that, but that is not the primary point of this passage. The primary point of this passage is Paul is referring to the holistic nature of this meal. Both eating and drinking is done wrong. So the drinking is done in excess while someone else doesn't even get any food. They are hungry. They are starving. And that's not supposed to be what is taking place when the church gathers together as God's people. There's also, it's always struck me as funny that people celebrated communion so exuberantly that they were getting drunk. And again, that is a sin, but let's not neglect this celebratory aspect to the Lord's Supper. So often we approach it with this somber mindset of, I need to make sure everything is confessed, everything is right, instead of using it as this celebration for the fact that the tomb is empty, that Jesus has risen again, that he did not stay dead. And so we can then look with eager anticipation forward to the day when he will finally return once again. Now, there's some other things that just kind of are bigger picture issues with communion that I didn't even have time to dig into. So first, verses 23 through 25 are where Paul passes on the tradition that Jesus began his last night on earth. One of those is, what elements should we use? So Jesus uses two common elements that everyone would have had easy access to: wine and bread. And so then people will sometimes argue that because those are the elements Jesus used, we must only use unleavened bread and wine. Otherwise, it's not actually communion. I remember sitting in on a council, so in the Evangelical Free Church of America, you have to write a theological position paper and then defend it to a council of other pastors. I was sitting in on one of my friends' ordination councils, and someone said, imagine with me, a student in student ministry is visiting an elderly shut-in, and they want to celebrate communion together, but all they have are Oreos and Mountain Dew. Does that count as communion? And my friend said, well, it's not ideal. I suppose we could, because those are the elements that we have there. And the guy continued pushing him of, that's not right, that's not right. And it's difficult, because how far do we take some of these ideas? Now it's difficult to, in my mind, get to blood when it's what you're drinking is green. That's part of the reason that you have wine or grape juice as we celebrate communion, because it looks similar to blood when you see blood sticking out. The bread looks similar to skin that you could see laying there. So it's supposed to serve as a reminder of these other pieces. But what elements can we use? Should it be only unleavened bread? Can we use leavened bread that has risen? What are these elements that we should use? One authorized reading said, we want to get as close as we can to these original elements, but there's nothing that prohibits using other elements as a part of our communion. And I think that's a helpful idea. If we're going back to that theological triage idea, I would consider these two elements a third order issue. The fact that we should celebrate communion should be taking place regularly among us, but we can have fun discussions even in the same gathering of God's people about what constitutes those two elements. Another piece, verse 25 says, as often as you drink it, in remembrance of me. We should make sure that we are celebrating, that we are remembering Jesus in the midst of communion. But it's not just in communion that we should be thinking about and celebrating Jesus. We should be doing that all the time. Verse 26 says, as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Now, this is somewhat getting to the question of what is significant about communion. Is it only memorial? Is it just done for us to remember back to what Jesus has done? And I think that is at least part of it. But there's a few different ways that theologians have argued for what takes place when we celebrate communion. So Roman Catholics, for instance, believe in transubstantiation. That is that the elements themselves, when they are blessed by the priest, actually become the literal body and blood of Jesus Christ. So that is Jesus saying, this, the bread that he takes, this is my body. So they take that literally. I mentioned in the I Am series that we did at the beginning of this year, there's a lot of statements that Jesus says that I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. When Jesus says I am the light of the world, we don't expect to turn the lights off and then if we could see him physically, see him glowing in the dark. These are figures of speech. That's where similarly this idea in verse 25, it says in remembrance. So we shouldn't take these things to automatically mean that he is literal bread and blood, or literal bread and wine. So that's where I would not agree with the idea of transubstantiation. But then in response to that, Luther came up to what is known, Luther during the Reformation came up with what is known as consubstantiation. So that is the belief that Jesus is in, around, all a part of the elements. So they don't literally become him, but Jesus is intimately and integrally involved within the elements. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, there's a memorial view, that this just serves as a memorial of what Jesus happened. So at the end of the day, I think these are more fun discussions that we can have. Jesus commanded it, therefore we obey it. So personally, I think it's a little bit more than a memorial, but that's really all I'm comfortable saying. And I take that view because of verse 30. And I didn't really talk about this at all yesterday. So verse 30 says, "That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died." That is not examining yourself before participating in communion together. So the spiritual reality, what we are doing when we celebrate communion together, seems to impact and influence the physical reality far more often than we realize or even admit. So I think some of what is taking place in communion is there's something spiritually nourishing about it. That's what we talked about in the EFCA statement of faith. It confirms and nourishes us as believers when these sacraments are celebrated, or ordinances are celebrated in true faith. Then verse 27, "Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup," and that's the where I said we shouldn't be hyper individualistic about this, but then we get to the question of who should celebrate communion. And what we see here is it should be the church. It is a bunch of messed up sinners who are in constant need of God's grace extended to us on a daily basis. But then you have theological discussions of you celebrate closed or open communion. So closed communion means only those people who have been baptized and are members in that church can celebrate communion. On the other side is the practice known as open communion, where you do not need to be a member of that church in order to participate in communion together. Now, one of the roles of those who are administering the elements is to do what is known as fencing the table. That is saying whoever is a believer in Christ is, according to the Bible, welcome to celebrate and participate with us. And that's where various churches will fence the table in different places. So I actually prefer the term close communion. That is anyone who is an active believer in Jesus Christ, who is intimately and integrally involved in the life of the local church, is able to come and celebrate this common family meal with us. What's a joy about being a part of the EFCA is there's a lot of different backgrounds that can celebrate communion together, which in other contexts would not be able to. So one example of that would be between Presbyterian and Baptists. If a Presbyterian went to a Baptist's church, they would not be able to celebrate communion there. But here in the EFCA, we welcome many different people to come and celebrate communion with us. So these are just a few of the different things and different conversations that take place in the midst of the communion conversation. But what's also I didn't get to talk about yesterday, end of verse 34, Paul says, "About the other things I will give directions when I come." These are one of those situations where I wish Paul had just taken time to explain exactly what it is he was talking about, because until we get to heaven, we are going to have no clue what it is that Paul is referring to here, or what questions the Corinthian church was trying to get answers from Paul. So one quick note before I sign off here, and that is that we have a congregational meeting at 9 o'clock this Sunday in the auditorium. So we're going to be going over the budget together, which has been posted and printed off the last couple of weeks. But if you've got any questions before we meet together this coming Sunday, please reach out to me or the overseers. I hope you guys are having a wonderful week, and we'll be back later this coming Sunday where we will be digging into prayers. See you then.